I was asked by Well and Kim to say a few words. My name is Ike Shahabar. I happen to be the landlord of the building. It's my honor to be a part of this beautiful organization. Tonight is, I think, the first night, I think they said that men are in the building. Primarily a ladies' organization, and tonight they're very honored and happy to Hello? They're honored and happy to have such a great turnout. So they asked me to say a few words and to introduce our esteemed speaker. They also prepared for Rabbi Eli Mansour to come. Unfortunately, he wasn't feeling well. He prepared a few nice words about Rabbi Eli, but I don't think he needs any introduction. So, so as I was saying, we have with us a very esteemed guest, Dr. Henry Abramson. He's been a wonderful friend and advocate to the Well. Not only has he provided us with the fantastic course material and the riveting presentations of Sephardic Jewish history for the past 2 semesters, he also promoted us and our mission on numerous fronts, including the uber important social media outlets, over which holds much sway. We have a tremendous amount of gratitude and appreciation to the doctor for all his help and professional guidance. For those of you that do not know, Dr. Henry Abramson serves as the Dean of the mighty Avenue J campus of Torah College. A native of Northern Ontario, Canada, he earned his PhD from the University of Toronto for a dissertation on the Jews of Ukraine, and he held postdoctoral and visiting appointments at Harvard, Oxford, Cornell, and the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He's the author of 7 books on Jewish history, and thought most recently from the years of wrath, the historical context of the Esh Kodesh, and is the only person ever to have been published by both Harvard University and Feldheim Publishers. Simultaneously. His research has been recognized with research grants from the National Endowment of the Humanities, the United States Holocaust and Memorial Museum, and he is a recipient of excellence in the Academy Award from the National Education Association. His personal website has over 20,000 followers, global followers, for his online lectures, not to mention the ever-popular Monday night lecture at Torah College, which are open to all the public every Monday night. So without further ado, I'd like to give him a warm welcome, Dr. Henry Abramson.
Thank you very much. I'm very grateful for those warm words of welcome. I am so honored to be here tonight, and I'm really disappointed that Rabbi Mansour is not here, because that's one of the main reasons I came, because I really wanted to hear him talk. So but I'm also deeply grateful for you here. And if you don't mind, can we just take a selfie? It'll be just take a second. This way. Okay, everybody. Okay, because it's such a big crowd. Wait a sec. I got to turn this around here. Okay. Hang on a sec. Anyone knows how to operate this? Here we go. Okay, everybody. Smile. Okay, I think I got us. One more time just in case. There we go. Oh, good. Wow, that's great. Okay. Wow, I'm going to send that to my wife, and so she knows I actually was here. Okay. So tonight's lecture is on an absolutely fascinating topic. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to be able to speak to you about it. I hope all of you at the back can hear me all right. Okay, great. So I'm going to speak for about 60 minutes or so. I'll pause at a few moments for questions. Please don't ask any hard questions, because this is not really my area of expertise, but I really enjoy studying this material, so we'll do it quickly together. Here we go. Let's just go back to the beginning of the lecture. Right. Okay. So first of all, great thanks to the Well. I'm a big fan of this institution. Ms. Weinberg came to my office a while ago. Of course, she's herself a distinguished Jewish historian, and she talked to me about this project, and I fell in love with it. I think it was absolutely fantastic. And I have to say, as a relative newcomer to New York, I think this is one of the great institutions of Sephardic research and study. It has such a phenomenal vibe. I just feel happy walking into this building, and I'm so grateful to be a small part of it. And this is one of those few things about New York that I really, really like. I come from Surfside, Florida most recently, so it takes a lot for me to really, really like something, but the Well is one of those places. So I want to give thanks to the institution for inviting me and for allowing me to participate in your academic life, especially to Ms. Weinberg for her inspiration in creating these kinds of programs, to Ms. Sassoon for her guidance and her leadership. And really, there's so many names I should thank, but I just want to say I'm really grateful to be here. And I wish Rabbi Wansur was here, but we'll skip past that. For those of you who heard a really nice introduction, I really appreciate it. This is an older picture of me from before I grew my beard. But my area of expertise is really the Jews of Eastern Europe, Ashkenazi Jewry. And I've written quite a few books on the Jews of Ukraine and the Jews of Poland and places like that. But I have so many Sephardi students who have been asking me for years to spend more time looking at Sephardic culture. And so this particular year, I decided to invest in it, and I've been giving a year-long series of lectures of the Jews of Spain from ancient times, the Visigothic era, right through the Gerush and up into the diaspora. It's an absolutely fantastic, amazing adventure of a history, and it's so inspirational to see that it is still alive and thriving here in South Brooklyn. And I'm hoping that today's presentation will perhaps inspire all of you to go on a little further in your own research and exploration of the Sephardic heritage, which is something that is not only shared by the narrow ethnic community itself, but by all Jews and really by world civilization as a culture that is worthy of emulation in so many ways. So here's my home campus. If you're interested, come by Monday nights at 7. That's when I give my live lecture. And also it's available online. I have a YouTube channel, things like that. I want to give a shout out to Mr. Lawson, who drove all the way from Connecticut for coming here. That's a big deal. Thank you, even through the flooded roads and everything. Okay. Well, okay, shout out. All right, let's go straight to the material. So first of all, thank you to my main source for tonight. I'm not going to say too much that especially original. As I mentioned, it's not really my area of expertise to give you original research. If you read this book already, you can leave the room because I'm basically going to do a 1-hour book review of the text. The microphone is on, right? Okay. But this, put it up closer. How's that? Oh, I talk really close like that. Okay. So this is the. No, I think we're okay. Can everyone see the images all right? Okay. At this time of night, if we turn the lights off, I will lose half the audience. So this is a great, very popular and very readable book, Sacred Trash. It has most of the things that we're going to talk about here. It's authored by Adina Hoffman and Peter Cole. They're both scholars of Sephardic poetry. Peter Cole has also, he has a real difficulty finding a great place to get a haircut, but he has nevertheless made some amazingly beautiful translations of Sephardic poetry. I highly recommend his work. So what exactly is the Geniza? Has anybody here, don't be ashamed, not heard of the Cairo Geniza before this event? Okay, great. So I'm speaking to you and all the other people here who were embarrassed to raise their hands. And those who have heard of Cairo, maybe heard of a Geniza, but not necessarily the two of them together. So let's understand what exactly is a Geniza. The word Geniza comes from a Persian root through Hebrew, which essentially means to store away, to treasure, to hide, or to simply dump somewhere. Lignoz means to hide away in modern Hebrew, and a Geniza is essentially a place where you put away things that you will probably never use again. It is not exactly the same as, let's say, for example, an ashpa, which would be like a garbage heap, but it's someplace special that you put things away forever. So like, for example, this picture here, which shows a modern Geniza in Israel, and it looks pretty much exactly like a dumpster, right? It's got graffiti on it and things like that, but there's a special purpose for a geniza. Anyone know what that purpose is? Exactly, right. So the halacha is that anything which is written with a holy name on it, a shem, hence shemot, or shmos, or as they say, how would I say? Shemot, right? I'll have to say a little more Sephardic. Shemot. Can everyone say shemot in a Sephardic pronunciation? Shemot, that's right. It's a little stronger segol under there, I guess, or a shvana. So anything that has God's name in it cannot be thrown away when it's no longer worthwhile. It's no longer usable, like an old prayer book that's falling apart. So you have to put it away someplace and then eventually treat it to a decent burial in a Jewish cemetery. So most synagogues have a geniza somewhere, a back room, a closet, something like that, where they put away their various goods. So this particular geniza, which is in a public street, it even has a sign here. It says, "Asul lizrok po zevel." It's which I would translate zevel normally as fertilizer, but I think what they mean here is like garbage. You can't throw garbage in here. This is not for garbage. It is for holy things like prayer books and so on. Now, the Jews of Cairo, Old Cairo, had an unusual habit, which turned out to be an amazing thing for us. Hundreds of years ago, they had a geniza in a synagogue, nothing special, but they developed this unusual custom that not only would they preserve holy books, worn out holy books, as we would in a contemporary synagogue, they would also preserve anything written, even partially, with Hebrew characters. Lashon HaKodesh, did I say that well? Thank you. Lashon HaKodesh. Lashon Kodesh. Anything written in the holy tongue, even partially, even if it was transliterated from Arabic, they saved it. And they threw it in their geniza, and so it remained for 1,000 years until it was discovered. And what was discovered there is absolutely mind-blowing. So just to give some of the geography, we're talking about a region where Jews had lived literally for millennia. Of course, we go back to Egypt in biblical period. And Old Cairo, which is known as Fustat, is here on the River Nile. The city itself moved a little further north. The synagogue itself was built in 1012. It was actually raised and then reconstructed. So we know that this particular structure is approximately 1,000 years old. Here it is, the Ben Ezra synagogue. This is not the original structure. It was renovated at the end of the 19th century and again by a Canadian team in the 20th century. But you get a sense of what it might have looked up to the original inhabitants. Here's a view of the interior. These are highly traditional electric lights that they had 1,000 years ago, but you get a sense of what this synagogue must have been like. Now, what's important to us is not the reconstructed interior of the synagogue, but this mysterious attic here with this ladder going up to the top. A legend had developed in Old Fustat that there was a serpent in the geniza, in this, kind of like upstairs attic crawl space, and anyone who went in there would be bitten to death by the serpent. Another legend, which sounds very Egyptian in nature, kind of like Harrison Ford, Raiders of the Lost Ark kind of thing. And by the way, I have a fondness for Harrison Ford because a lot of my students say that I have a striking resemblance. Either him or Will Smith. The two of them, I often in the street, I walk in Manhattan. Okay, so there was another Egyptian legend that anyone who saw the inside of the geniza would not live out the year. And so for 1,000 years, the geniza remained undisturbed until the 1800s, when a few pieces of manuscripts that were in the geniza began to circulate in the black market. And there's a whole cavalcade of interesting people who came across pieces of the geniza. They began to leak out into European collectors who began to say, hey, there's something interesting coming out of this old synagogue in Fustat, but no one knew the extent of it until it was discovered by these individuals in particular. These two women, Agnes Lewis and Margaret Gibson, twin sisters with a very unusual upbringing. They're raised by a Protestant minister in England who promised his young daughters that he would take them to any country in the world as long as they learned its language first. So they took him up on his offer, and they learned French and Italian and German, and then they moved on to Arabic and Turkish, and they got to be really quite well traveled and also very well educated. Here they're shown, by the way, in their cap and gowns, but they were denied admittance to Cambridge University, even though they ended up doing some absolutely stellar world-class research, including discovering manuscripts, Syriac manuscripts of the New Testament in monasteries in the Sinai, and translations from Syriac and so on. Really world-class scholars who were unfortunately never recognized in their lifetime, primarily because they were women. At any rate, the twin sisters were both widowed at a young age, and they took their considerable fortune and they translated it into a life of world travel, where they went around all kinds of exotic locales and visited the locals and did all kinds of interesting research. They were known, because they were virtually inseparable, as the Giblus, from Gibson Lewis. These two twin sisters, not Jewish, highly intellectual, very well educated, and fascinated with everything. They went to this synagogue in Old Fustat, and when they were told about the legends about the snake and about you won't live out a year, they said that's ridiculous, and they insisted on climbing up into the attic, and they saw the most amazing thing there. And they grabbed a few pieces of paper or parchment that were there, and they returned them to their friend, Solomon Schechter, who was at this time a reader in rabbinics at Cambridge University. An Eastern European rabbi with a strong intellectual bent. They saw him in the street in Cambridge and said, "Oh, you won't believe, we just got back from Cairo, and we brought this interesting document for you." And they gave him this moldy old piece of parchment. He looked at it, and he was momentarily stunned. He shook his head. He says, "Can I take this away and just spend some time with it?" And they said, "Sure, go ahead." And then he wrote to them that very same day and sent them a telegram, and then went to see them, because they had discovered a long-lost manuscript that had never been known in Hebrew for 1,000 years, specifically the Ben Sira manuscript that I'll show you shortly. Ultimately, after several decades of effort, they brought hundreds of thousands of fragments of documents out of the Geniza and spread them out. They ended up in many universities around the world, including here in America. Princeton has a fair collection, but the Cambridge collection is by far the most impressive. Here is a photograph of Solomon Schechter working with many of the documents. This is a stage photograph. One of the main differences between what you see here and what it really would have been like is that he was forced to wear a covering on his nose and mouth, because the stench of these rotting documents was absolutely terrible. And anyone who worked with it would be suffering from all kinds of respiratory illnesses unless they took precautions. Yes, please. Okay. I can't believe I actually have. I have people in room 4. That over there? Okay, hang on a second. I'm just going to go say hi to them. I'll be right back. Okay, I'll just go say hi in real life. Where's room 4? Is it over this way?
Yeah, what?
Is it down over here? Room 5? This is room 5 over here, right? Room 4 down there. Okay, let's go say hi. Hi. No, they saw it. They're having fun. That's everything. Okay, I don't know. They're actually having a lot more fun over there. They have alcohol. They have, Okay. Anyways, let's turn this light off because they can't see the. How's that? Okay. All right, room 4. We got the screen on now. So this is what the Geniza essentially looked like for about 50 years as people began to work through it. But one of the things that I have not given away yet is the fact that the amazing thing about the Geniza is that it is an entire cross-section of life in ancient Egypt. It's not just, I mean, we love old prayer books. We love all kinds of things you find in these publications. But it was everything. Bills of sale, ketubot, marriage contracts, business contracts, love letters, documents in Chinese, the world's oldest scraps of Yiddish, everything, even one of my favorites, a petek, a charity collector's document, you know, like the laminated things, all the way from Kiev. It gives you a sense of everything that was happening in the entire Mediterranean basin for about 500 years. It's an absolutely incredible discovery, and I hope to share with you in the next few minutes the kinds of things they found there. Okay, so what is in the treasure? Sorry, I hear a question at the back. Oh, what was the reaction of the local population? They loved it because they paid for them. There was a lot of money. Like they thought, this is one of the the takeaways of the Geniza that I'm going to talk about at the end of the class, but everybody who thought it was trash turned out to be wrong. And this goes over several generations of scholars. Every scholar says, okay, that's it. We've taken everything from the Geniza. And then another scholar comes along and says, you totally missed this other aspect. And they discovered an even greater treasure. So it's an ongoing problem of misunderstanding, underestimating the value of this trove. So the local population there, they were great with it. As long as you paid the requisite bribes, and Schechter was fed up with it because he describes how, you know, you have to pay someone, you have to pay the bribe to the guy who stands at the front door, you have to pay a bribe to the guy, or a tip to the guy who comes in and says, how are you doing? You have to pay a bribe to the guy who comes in and brings you a cup of tea. It's like everybody is there and you have to actually tip every single person. So they were happy with it at the time. Later, of course, when it was discovered how great it is, this is the tragedy perhaps of the all colonialized peoples, but we're not going to focus on the negative for today. Let's go straight to the material here. So here is the first document that really became famous, a fascinating book called The Wisdom of Ben Sira. This is a book which was revered by Jews in the ancient period, the Second Temple period, and it came very close into making it into the Bible. At the time, the rabbis were discussing, what are we going to include in the Bible? Which books are we not going to include in the Bible? There's a large number of books that were considered valuable, but for one reason or another, didn't quite make it in. The Gemara records many times when the rabbis had a long debate. Many rabbis felt, for example, we should not include the book of Kohelet. Koheles? Kohelet? It's terrible. I feel so bad. Ecclesiastes. We shouldn't include it because it's got too much negative cynicism. And other rabbis said, no, it ends well, so keep it. Song of Songs. You know, if you ever read a not a Jewish translation of Song of Songs, just read what the words say. It's pretty, R-rated. The rabbi said no way, but Rabbi Akidah said no, it's Kadosh Kadoshim. We have to keep Shir HaShirim. So a lot of the books didn't make it. Among the books that didn't make it, the so-called Sfarim Chitzoniim, the outside books, was the Wisdom of Ben Sira, which is a lot like Mishlei, a lot like Kohelet in many ways, but it was lost to the Jewish tradition because it was considered one of the outside books. The Christian tradition, however, kept it in Greek. They loved it, and it became essentially a holy Greek book. Just one second, let me finish the sentence. It became a holy Greek book, and the Christians thought it was fantastic, and its Jewish origins were lost. But many scholars felt this is actually a Jewish book, and by finding the Hebrew original, all of a sudden they reclaimed this very important document in the Jewish literary tradition. Yes, please. The Gemara indicates that he's actually an illegitimate child, or not exactly illegitimate, but he's the offspring of Yirmiyahu HaNavi. So now it's a bizarre story exactly how it was. I'm not going to go into it now. When I'm off the microphone, I will. It's a bizarre story. about Ben Sira. But it is a fascinating book. At any rate, this is only the tip of the iceberg, however. The kind of things they found in the Geniza were mind-blowing. That first generation of scholars under Solomon Schechter, they found, for example, autographed copies of Maimonides' work. This is a page from the Mishnah Torah written by the Rambam, the Nesher HaGadol, the Great Eagle. And for those of you who have studied the Rambam in depth, you'll know that his word choice is absolutely specific. And the more you study his remarkably deceptive Hebrew style, you see how he's so careful about the choice of words. Finally, we're able to see, as you see from this example here, what he decided not to include, what he decided to change. The Rambam's own autographed copy of his first version of the Mishnah Torah. Mind-blowing, tremendous scholarly value. And we have, of course, his signature here, Moshe ben Reb Maimon here. To have the actual signature of the Rambam is such a glorious thing to contemplate. These are the kinds of things that were found in the Geniza library. That's a close-up of it. Also found there were documents, personal letters about Yehuda Halevi, the great Sfaradi poet and philosopher who spent his last days traveling to Israel. And for many, many generations, there was a legend that what had happened was after a long and difficult travel, he finally made it to Eretz Israel. He bent down, and then he was trampled to death by either a crusader or a Muslim horseman and killed him there. And then in the late 19th century, people said, scholars said, wait a second, we don't have any sources to prove this. People are saying it's a legend, it's a story. He just disappeared, that's all. But what we found in the Geniza were letters which he wrote or received when he was actually in Cairo en route to Israel. And then we found letters written shortly after he left Cairo that said that he went to Israel, and they used two letters after his name, Zayin Lamed, Zecha Livracha, which indicate that shortly after he arrived in Israel, he was killed. The letters do not confirm exactly how he was killed, but they do confirm that he made it to Eretz Israel, and there he died. So these amazing kind of like stories of famous Jews are replete in the documents of the Geniza, and this alone would have made it a find of a millennium. But there is still so much more. Another amazing thing that we find in the Geniza are all kinds of new voices, people that we'd never heard from before. For example, look at this document here. And this is an example of what they call a palimpsest, which means a document that has several layers of text. You can see here, poking underneath this Hebrew text, you see these Greek letters. The reason for this, if you're familiar with the Mishnah and the Pirkei Avot, very beautiful Mishnah, it says that Halnomed Yeled Lama Hu Domeh, like a person who learns as a child. What is it compared to? Anyone remember the rest of the Mishnah? It's like it's ink on new parchment. And so you imagine the parchment is like fresh, it's white, you got nice black ink, and it soaks in really well, good contrast, and so on. And then it says someone who learns older, like a Baal Tshuva, like Rabbi Akiva, who learns at an older age. What is he compared to? Like someone who writes on rubbed parchment. What does rubbed parchment mean? So what they used to do back in those days with the printing technology, is they would, my update is ready, great. How about, let's do remind me later, okay? They would take the parchment, because it's expensive. You had to shecht an animal to make this parchment, and they would take like some kind of scapula, like a stiff ruler type device, and then they would rub it really hard. That would not remove the ink from the writing, but would kind of like grind it down further into the fibers of the parchment. Just click remind me later. Okay. There we go. Thank you so much. And that would make the parchment much darker, because you'd be smushing the ink in, and less able to hold the contrast of the new ink, but you could nevertheless write on top of it again. And you could reuse the document by sort of erasing the words underneath, but not truly erasing, because the various chemicals within the inks would eventually cause them, ghost-like, to rise up and be seen again after 100 or so years of resting. So when they discovered this document, they looked at the Greek and they said, oh my gosh, this is a classic Greek language literal translation of the Bible by none other than the famous Aquila, who was a very important source for, among others, Onkelos, who translated the Bible into Aramaic. And we knew that there was such a person, Aquila. We knew that he did a translation. We had never seen it before. It is, by the way, an absolutely unreadable translation because he translates it into the Greek in exactly the same order and syntax as the Hebrew, designed to be such a way that you could go back and learn the Hebrew from the Greek. So people were like so excited. Wow, look at this. We found this amazing document underneath a document. And they started publishing pieces of this. 20 years after publishing this, guess what someone did? They decided to look at the top level, the Hebrew, which was staring us in the face the whole time. It turns out that the top level are the long-lost poems of the great Yanai, one of the greatest poets who ever lived in Jewish tradition, of whom we only have 3 or 4 poems. And all of a sudden, we had 400 poems by Yanai that were on top of these things. We're looking at the Greek the whole time and not realizing that this is Yanai himself. Yanai was such a great poet that it was rumored that his master, after teaching him, is an ancient poet, like 4th century, I believe, that his master, after having taught him and seeing how beautiful a poet he was, he tried to assassinate him by putting a scorpion in his shoe. Now, it's a legend that's probably not true, but never the fact that they tell this story about Yanai gives you a sense of it. So these are some of the amazing things they're finding in the Geniza by looking at the document in different levels. Oh, yeah, so there's Yanai. You can see the liturgical poem there. Now, here's another one of my favorites. Ms. Weinberg, of course, brilliant scholar. She recognized this. What is this, Ms. Weinberg? Oh, yes, this is a poem by the famous Dunash ibn Labrat, an amazing individual, came from Babylon to Sfarad in the 10th century. He was a protege of Chastai ibn Shaprut, one of the great statesmen of the era. And he started essentially a revolution in Hebrew poetry because he said, you know, Hebrew poetry, the way we have it right now, is really very nice, but the reality is, Taka, the Arabs have much more beautiful poetry than we do. They're making such beautiful poetry in Arabic, there's no comparison. And what's the big difference? Meter. The Hebrew poems, and you can see it if you go to an Ashkenazi shul, they do this all the time. The poems all have a very standard, simple meter that repeats itself repetitively and is actually kind of boring. But in Arabic poetry, they have short and long stops in the meter, which renders a much more beautiful effect. And Dunash said, you know what, we can adapt this Arabic style to Hebrew by simply differentiating between the Shva Nach and the Shva Na, and all of a sudden he opened up a whole new technique of writing poetry. We should realize that in 10th century and 11th century Spain, poetry was so important to the Sfaradim living there that they literally had riots. I mean, violent encounters between those who supported the traditional form of poetry under Menachem ibn Saruk and those who supported the newfangled Arabic-style poetry pioneered by Ibn Labrat. It turned out that Ibn Labrat won. So this is an example of a poem. You can see it says at the top here, Dunash ibn Labrat. However, Ms. Weinberg, brilliant as she is actually incorrect because about 10 years later, another scholar found the other half of the poem. And there it is. And it says at the top here, Le'eshet Dunash ibn Labrat. From the wife, Mi Eshet, from the wife of Dunash ibn Labrat. It was a love poem written in Babylon to her husband living in Spain, giving him a hard time for leaving her. And all of a sudden, we have here the very first poem written by a woman preserved in the entire Hebrew canon. just an amazing find. All of a sudden, you have this evidence of women as literate individuals expressing themselves in the art form of the day. It's absolutely astounding. And these are all the kinds of things that come from little scraps of paper that preserve themselves in the Geniza archives. Yes, question?
So sources from the 3rd century BCE on the Septuagint make us believe that the Jews really spoke mostly Greek.
Mm-hmm.
So all these documents that came later on, was there a shift back to Lashon HaKodesh and Arabic, or were they mostly from outside the country?
Well, the reality is we're talking about such vast, the question had to do with what language Jews are speaking at what time. We're talking about such vast scope of Jewish history that it's hard to generalize, but I'm going to do it anyways. Jews tend to be polyglots. Here in America, it's unusual where Jews tend to only speak English. But for the vast majority of our history, we have spoken one language at home, typically a Jewish language, often a hybrid between the Jewish and the secular language, like Judeo-Arabic or Yiddish or Ladino. And we've spoken a secular language in the street, and we've spoken Hebrew in the synagogue. So these, what is the primary language of Jews? It varies from country to country and place to place, but we typically engage in many different languages in all of our correspondence. And the Geniza bears that in true as well. Many of the documents are written in Arabic, but in Hebrew characters. And in fact, Yiddish is essentially German written in Hebrew characters, because we knew how to write before the Germans did, and so we used our own alphabet for their language. But we're comfortable in many different languages, and the Geniza shows a huge cross-section. Mr. Lawson.
I've noticed, or I've seen, there's also a significant amount of Karaite material.
Yes.
That is Tanakh, written in Arabic characters, in the New Cod,
Right.
First of all, I'm wondering if
Well, you're starting to ask a hard question here. I'm a little bit nervous, but
anybody explored that it seems like while we, the rabbinic Jews, right, we're using Arabic, and we're writing in the Hebrew characters.
yeah. Well,
Whereas, has anybody looked at this?
absolutely. Marina Rusto, who will show you here, she's actually on this particular screen. She's done a lot of work on this. I'll give it away, though, a little bit out of sequence. We know about the Cairo community that there was a significant number of Karaites living there as well. Karaites, of course, from a 9th century movement that denied the validity of the oral Torah and wanted to get back to the Qur'an, the text itself, and they accepted the Bible. And we, as rabbinic Jews, tend to view them as hopeless heretics. And when you look historically, most of the stuff we tend to have focuses on how bad they are and how we tried to push them away and how they were like constantly interfering with the things we were doing and stuff like that. But once you get into the Geniza documents, it doesn't point that picture at all. We got along with them, we married with the Karaites, we did business with them, we schmoozed with them, a lot like in America, where you would have Orthodox Jews who still have lots of conservative and reform and even non-religious Jewish friends, and occasionally they'll marry each other and they'll certainly do business with each other, and it's a much more relaxed society. So in other words, the version of history that we tend to absorb, it comes from one narrow place, essentially the rabbinic elite, who really don't like the Karaites. But most Jews are like, okay, so he's a Farshtunken Karaite, but we still move on. Let me move on a little bit further because I'm worried we won't make to the time. Yes. Okay, all right. Room 4, not in front of the projector. I'll go over here. So weird having a room 4. I'll get to your question in a second, sir. Let me move on a little further. So now the next generation. So the first generation of scholars really focused on the rabbinic texts. Let's look for the Rambam. Let's look for Yehuda Ibn Tibbon or whatever we can find like that. And the rest is just garbage. The second generation began to look at things like palimpsests and began to look at multiple layers. The third generation, which is the 1950s, under the work of S.D. Goitein, began to say, wait a second. What about all that other stuff that isn't about famous people? Because the Geniza is filled with scraps of paper that are not written by important people. In fact, probably about 80% of it is written and it's just regular detritus of everyday life. Very difficult to read. It's all packed together. It's in fragments and so on. So what Goitein did was he said, I'm going to devote my life, and he ended up composing 6 massive volumes under the title A Mediterranean Society, in which he traced every single name, address, piece of furniture, clothing, spice, recipe, anything he could find, and connected it as best he could to give us a sense of what life must have been like in Old Cairo for a few hundred years that the Ben Ezra synagogue was in existence. And he found some amazing characters like Wusha the broker. This is not a picture of her, but she sort of looks like I imagine she would be, who was an amazingly wealthy woman living in Old Cairo. And he managed to find a lot of documents about her. People used to give their children brachas saying, may you be like Wusha. That was like a common phrase. People would say this, like we say, may you be like, Menashe and Ephraim, but they used to say, may you be like Wusha, Whusha. And he wrote quite a bit about it. And she had a rather amazing life. She was a phenomenal businesswoman, but she also got into a little bit of trouble where she actually had a child out of wedlock. And as she was getting older, she was worried, that maybe he would not be able to get married, her child, because he didn't have a father. It turned out it's a whole story how that happened. It's a little bit R-rated, but so she wanted to make sure that no one would consider her son a mamzer. No one would consider her, being unmarriageable. So she actually arranged for a legal sting where the rabbis would come by as a certain person confessed to being the father, and that way the rabbis were able to actually confer, yes, we know that so-and-so is the father, and although she wasn't married to him at the time, nevertheless, he is legitimate. An amazing, bizarre story, but the fantastic part of it, remember, people would give brachas in her name. She gave a tremendous amount of, when she went to the one particular synagogue on Yom Kippur, the rabbi of the shul stood up and said, a woman like this, we don't want you here. And she was kicked out of the shul on Yom Kippur. Can you imagine going to shul in front of the whole community, and the rabbi gets up and says, you are not welcome here? She nevertheless absorbed the insult, and she gave, in her will, a phenomenal amount of money to every single shul in the community, including the one that kicked her out, and they were able to light the menorot, the candles in the shul, for dozens of years because of her donations. So even though she had kind of a checkered past, nevertheless, Geniza tells the arc of her life story, and we see that it's quite a bit more complicated than we would think. Fascinating kind of personal details. Also interesting, does anyone recognize what this would be? Yeah, this is a children's scrap school book where the child is learning how to write the letters and the vowels. And this is probably at the end because it says chazak right at the end of the text. And here's the bracha for the Torah and so on. But we see that they learn how to write essentially the same way we do today. And here, just like our kids today, when the teacher was a little boring, then they would doodle. And so we have this guy looks sort of like a super Israeli soldier here with the Star of David and things like that. But we see these amazing, really human documents in the Geniza that give us a sense of real living people engaged in these things. And this is finally the work of Marina Rustow, who's the recipient of a MacArthur's, the so-called Genius Grants. She's working in the Princeton University because she said, you know what? People have already looked at all of the famous people. People have looked at all of the Hebrew scraps. I'm going to look at all of the Arabic texts now. And instead of working with the Hebrew things, she looked at the things that were written in Arabic, like on the back of Hebrew documents or mixed in with Hebrew documents. And she has also been able to paint for us a very complex picture of what society was like. And it was amazingly a lot more tolerant than we would think. Jews got along with their neighbors, the neighbors got along with the Jews. Amazingly, Jews got along with each other, which is a phenomenal thing, really hard to believe, more fiction than otherwise. Okay, so let me take your question, sir. Well, basically, yeah. Absolutely. We have the documents of Sadia in the Geniza as well. And we even have, otherwise we only have Sadia's responses to the Karaite books. In the Geniza, you actually have the Karaite books as well. The Geniza tells a different story, though. I know, it's amazing. If you look at the Geniza documents, you have ketubot written for explicitly between Karaites and Rabbanites. Now, the way the society evolved, the Rabbanites definitely, got the upper hand numerically, sociologically, and so on. But the Karaites were they were considered full Jews, and we had more relations with them than you would think. I recommend you to read Goitein's work. It's mind-blowing. I know, it's really shocking to me too. Please, let's go on. So let's just think for a second about what's next with the Geniza studies. So what we have at this point are hundreds of thousands of tiny fragments that have not been deciphered yet. Literally hundreds of thousands. This is the work of decades, perhaps centuries. We luckily have a lot more techniques to work with today. Things like they iron the documents out. Quite often you have the documents all folded within a packet, and they have to rehumidify them to add moisture in the air to slowly be able to get them to release their grip on the documents themselves. We can use modern ultraviolet lighting techniques to try and get a sense of what's written underneath the text and so on. But perhaps the most fascinating is the use of computer technology to discover the contents of the Geniza. This is an amazing site from Cambridge University, and what I like about this best, I'm sure you can't see this further back, but these lines over here, these are fragments of the month. Like every month, they post some incredible discovery that they found in the Geniza. And poetry and personal documents and things like that. It's like a newspaper. You're reading bit by bit, uncovering new things about the life of Sephardi Jews. And finally, you also have new crowdsourcing ventures. Like, for example, to get over here today, I give a lecture I mentioned at Avenue J, and I had to get here for tonight's lecture, so I took an Uber. Uber is a crowd-sharing, ride-sharing device where I get on the internet and somebody who has a car is willing to give me a lift. I'm willing to give them money, and it all works out very well, much better than taxis. So the latest Geniza researchers, like this Friedberg Society, they give you a chance to actually look at the Geniza itself. Here's my favorite. This is Scribes of the Cairo Geniza. And I strongly recommend that when you go home tonight, you go and check this out. Let's do it together ourselves, though. So here we are. This is the actual website. And we can skip this here. Is this the website? Hang on. Here it is over here. Right. So this is the actual website. Help us unlock the mysteries of the Cairo Geniza. So we click on Get Started. And what they will do is they will give, they give you some information here. They will give you, here is a piece of the Cairo Geniza that nobody has translated yet. It's been, photographed, microfilmed, and they want to ask you some questions. So they ask you over here, what language is this in? And it looks to me, I would say it looks like Hebrew, right? What do you think? So I'll say Hebrew, right? And then I go down a little bit and I say next. And then it's going to say, is this written in formal or informal? Meaning, is it like a personal letter, or does it look like some kind of official document? My guess is formal. What do you think? Formal? I think so. Yeah, let's go with formal. And then they're going to ask me, are there any perpendicular texts or diagonal texts? Because they're looking for palimpsest. They're looking for thing underneath. I would say no, it doesn't look like there's anything like that in this document. So I go like this. I say none of these features appear. And then I click on done. And then they file it away. And here's your next fragment. And you can do this yourself. And they're hoping that thousands of people worldwide will chip in and help do that first level of sorting. So all the Hebrew documents are in one place, all of the Arabic in another place, all the multiple languages in a third place. And the next level will obviously have someone who's a little bit more adept at the language being able to say, is this written in 9th century style or is this written in 8th century style? And they will slowly, through crowdsourcing, be able to bring these things together. This is an absolutely amazing use of modern technology to make the Geniza available for all. Okay, so let's bring this to a close in my concluding remarks here, what this means for all of us. So, and when I say all of us here, I mean like all Jews, really. So here's some takeaway messages. The first one is, trash is not trash. Like the things that we tend to consider insignificant may have phenomenal importance. I mean, I know, for example, in my own family, my Aunt Molly's candlesticks went missing. We packed them in a box and we could never find them. We feel terrible about that. But that's just one set of candlesticks from only about 70 years ago. Can you imagine what these documents mean and what you have in your own homes right now that may be valuable to your great-grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren and so on? Secondly, as we discussed a few times now, Goitein's argument was that Egyptian society was essentially a religious democracy. That's his term. And what he means by it is that basically it was a pretty liberal place where people mainly got along. You got along with non-Jewish neighbors. You got along with Karaite neighbors. It was much, he says, amazingly like America, which is kind of mind-blowing when we look at the very bloody century that we just went through and the Holocaust and the wars. Certainly look at Jewish-Arab relations today. It doesn't seem like that anymore, but perhaps it was possible once. And third, as my father, Oliver Shalom, used to say, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose, which means the more it changes, the more it stays the same. In other words, the kind of things that people are worried about today, it's amazing to hear those voices expressed from the Geniza. There's a whole cycle of letters, for example, from mothers written to their sons, saying, why don't you visit me? You never write. I'm sorry without you. And you read these things and say, oh my gosh, that's exactly like it is today. So you really feel how vibrant this society reaches out to us over the centuries and is able to inspire us today. And for me, at any rate, it helps me sort of focus on what's important in my life. Let's go to what this means for Sephardim. And speaking as a non-Sephardi, I hope I'm not being presumptuous by suggesting how Sephardim should take special ownership of the Geniza as their cultural heritage and how it should be advanced as a core project for the Sephardic community. So, first of all, I think you can, from the Geniza, it's really worth meditating on the Sephardic genius. What do I mean by the genius? One of the things that really stands out about the society of Jews in the Iberian Peninsula was their uncanny ability, which was unparalleled, perhaps in no other period of Jewish history, to find what is best in secular society without compromising on what is ultimately Jewish in value. That the Sephardim were able to identify those elements which were crucial to their survival as a people, and yet could borrow from Arabic poetry, Arabic music, Visigothic forms. There are all kinds of things that they were able to find to negotiate that very difficult space. In Ashkenazic lands, the Jews tend to either veer off into open assimilation, or they tend to become extremely insular and frightened of the outside world, regarding it as highly toxic and poisonous to the Jews. So I think in the Geniza, we really get a picture of a modus vivendi, a Weltanschauung that the Sephardim have exemplified for hundreds of years. Secondly, who owns Geniza studies? I mean, who really is, whose patrimony is this? I think that this is a place to inspire young Sephardic scholars. The Ashkenazim, we can find a few documents scattered throughout the Geniza, a few Yiddish scraps, a few letters from travelers, but this is fundamentally the life of a Sephardic community and its interconnectedness throughout the Mediterranean basin. And I believe that young Sephardic Jews should see the Geniza as a source of tremendous wisdom from the ages, from their bobbies and zaydis. I don't know how to say that in Spanish or something. There you like that, okay? This is an amazing Sephardic heritage that, why are all the great scholars, I don't know if Marina Rusto is Sephardic, but Goitein is not, and Schechter is not. There are all these Ashkenazic dudes. Why don't we get some Sephardim in there studying it? And finally, I think the submerged voices that come from the Geniza, particularly those of women, like the voices of the wife of Dunash ibn Labrat, the story of Wusha the broker. We really begin to hear women's voices in a very unique way, and they have been submerged for so many centuries. And that's why I think the well is such an amazing place to study and work and learn, because here's a place where women can celebrate their shared experience of the world, and they can rejoice in how they have a share in the millennial history of Sephardic Jews. So, well, wait a second. This is my big finish here. Hang on. I'll come back to you in a second. These Sephardim are so rowdy. Ashkenazim are much easier. Okay, let me wrap it up. You've been an extremely gracious and patient audience, especially over there in room 4. Thank you very much for watching. I'm going to hang around and I'll take some questions. Thank you very much for listening to me.